set a meeting sometime this week, 15 minutes to talk about this.
So several of you were at the guest speaker yesterday. What was the most interesting thing you learned from Dr. Williams? What's that mean?
Potentially Ebola could be airborne.
Potential that Ebola can become airborne? That's pretty scary, isn't it? Extremely scary. Anything else that struck you or was new information to you? Dr. Morton had a lot of questions he wanted to ask, but you said you had a couple words to say?
Yeah, about lab. Please be early so that you're ready to go at the very beginning of lab, because initially it's a little hectic because it's timed for the first hour and a half. Yeast cultures being available, so if you're late, you get started late, that affects the whole progress of the lab. Plus, even though you don't have a quiz, please take the time to at least read over the protocol so you have a clue as to what it is you're doing. Because, as I mentioned, it's a little hectic in the beginning until you get into a pattern. And most importantly is to try to be a little early, or at least on time.
So we understand why Monday's lab, probably didn't have time to spend, pre-reading the lab, but the rest of the week's labs, that shouldn't be an issue. Dr. Morton commented that he noticed a real difference on Monday just in terms of how the lab flowed, and so that reinforced to us that forcing you to read the lab by giving you these pre-lab quizzes is useful and beneficial and makes the lab a better experience. So come in prepared. No. So any questions? We're starting anew. You will get your exams back tomorrow. You can stop by Natalie's office after lunch and pick them up. There will be an opportunity for you to recoup some points. I think you did that last semester on one of the exams, didn't you? Where you have to do corrections and things. If you didn't do as well as you wanted to do, so for many of you this was a learning experience having a first exam for me. But if you didn't do as well as you wanted to do, then you need to get some help, preferably from both Austin and me, or Dr. Morton. But don't just repeat the same mistakes next exam. If your strategy of studying didn't work well for you this time, then you need to come up with a new strategy. Okay? Don't get overly concerned as long as you make proper adjustments, because there's a lot of points in the course, and one exam does not completely determine your grade in class. Okay? Okay, so this is an outline of what we're going to be covering in the next couple of weeks. And there's going to be, again, a pretty close correlation between what we're talking about in the classroom section and what you're doing in lab, particularly as we launch into next week. Is that when the enzyme started already? Next week? Okay. So there'll be a good correlation between that. I need to give you kind of a warning, and that is this particular chapter, and really the next couple of chapters that deal with energy and metabolism, are not easy. They're not necessarily always intuitive. There are concepts that you might not be familiar with or ever heard about before, such as ideas of exergonic and endergonic and spontaneity and free energy changes. And so for this material particularly, it can really be helpful if you can try to read through the chapter ahead of time to kind of get an idea of what topics are going to be covered and to get a sense of what you might find difficult and what you might not find as difficult. So for example, some of the stuff we're going to talk about today as an introduction you've heard before. But then that's going to transition later in this class period and definitely into Thursday into some new topics that are really a little bit hard to wrap your head around. And so if you can find the time to read ahead in the next chapter, I would highly recommend that. Okay? So, let's get started. Anybody know what these are? Mushrooms? Not magic mushrooms. What kind of mushrooms are these? Do mushrooms normally look like that? These are bioluminescent mushrooms. And they have the ability, because they have some particular genes that allow them to produce compounds that, under certain conditions, will produce light as chemical energy is transformed into light energy. Anybody have any idea why mushrooms might bioluminesce? That's an interesting area of speculation. There are some theories out there, and I think probably the biggest one has to do with attraction of insects, for example, that might be involved in spreading the mushroom spores, and that's an important part of their life cycle. We don't absolutely know for certain. You are going to be exposed to bioluminescence later in the semester in lab. What we're going to do is we're going to take a gene from a bioluminescent jellyfish and genetically insert it into a bacterium, changing that bacteria into a bioluminescent species. And that's going to be your first foray into genetic engineering, and then we'll follow that up with a little project-based lab. So you're going to come back and have some experience with this later on. So in bioluminescence, an energy transformation is taking place. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about for the next several weeks, are energy transformation. So what's our definition of energy? What's the basic definition of energy? This is something you probably learned in middle school, probably, right? What is energy? How do we typically define energy? It's a capacity to do something. Capacity to do work. Okay? What do we typically associate with work? Well, typically we think of something like, lifting something. That's a form of work. We've already talked about several forms of cellular work. We talk about transport. Active transport, for example. We've talked about flagellar motion. We have talked about muscle cells contracting. Okay? So typically we associate work with some type of movement. What's another thing that those three types of work that we've already talked about have in common? What do we need to accomplish that work? What's the definition of work? Energy. Capacity to work, right? So we need energy to do work. And what's the form of energy that the cell typically expends to do cellular work? It uses ATP. And what does it do? ATP is hydrolyzed into two molecules, ADP and phosphate. And what is that phosphate significance? What can that phosphate be used for? It can be used to phosphorylate and dephosphorylate proteins, and what does that do to them? Changes their shape. And so typically the work that's actually done is associated with some kind of conformational change in the shape of a protein. Okay? So I think a lot of times people think of ATP as being kind of a fuel like gasoline. And that we burn it, some kind of energy is released that powers cellular work. We're going to have to readjust our thinking a little bit about ATP and cellular work. And that's one of the challenges I'm going to have, is trying to get you to think a little bit differently about ATP and how its hydrolysis contributes to the ability of a cell to do that necessary work. So capacity to do work. What are some of the types of work? We've already talked about that. Here's an analogy that we're going to use quite a bit in energy and even cell energetics. And that is an analogy of a dam. Okay? Can a dam be used to produce work? Yep. This is a particular type of dam called a hydroelectric dam. And as water passes from the reservoir through channels in the dam called spillways, if there's a turbine installed in that dam, as the water rushes through the blades of the turbine, it spins the turbine, and that will generate electricity. Okay? And this particular dam will continue to generate electricity as long as there is a difference in the level of water behind the dam and below the dam. Okay? Well, we're going to use this analogy several times, most importantly when we talk about chemiosmosis and production of ATP in the mitochondria, and we'll make some analogies about this dam and relate it to mitochondrial function. Well, we can break up energy into two major categories, and those categories are kinetic energy and potential energy. What's the distinction between kinetic and potential? What's kinetic energy? Could be heat, especially if that heat is high temperature. It's energy in motion, okay? What is potential energy? It's energy that's stored, okay? Potential energy is due to the position, composition, or condition of matter. Which of these represents kinetic energy?
Water.
The water running through the turbine, right? That energy of motion. Okay. What represents potential energy in this slide? The water behind the lake. Why? Because of its position or its elevation in this particular case. Okay? And water moves via gravity from this higher level to this lower level. Sometimes compounds will have potential energy because of their chemical composition. And when we talk about chemical composition, basically we're talking about chemical bonding. Some molecules are very energy rich because of the nature of the chemicals that they're composed of and the way they're bonded together. One of the things I'm going to want to start equating to you is that anytime we have molecules that have a lot of hydrogen associated with them, that is associated with levels of high potential energy. Start thinking of hydrogens as stored energy in food molecules. And the greater the amount of hydrogen that's present in the molecule, the more potential energy that it has. So, what has a higher ratio of hydrogen to carbon, a fat or a carbohydrate? Remember? Actually, fats do. They've got a lot more hydrogen per carbon than a carbohydrate does. And that is why fats are typically good energy storage molecules in organisms or even in cells. Because they're loaded with hydrogen. So those hydrogens represent potential energy. Okay? So composition, typically we're talking about chemical composition and the way things are bonded together, particularly carbon-hydrogen bonds. If you know what I'm referring to when I'm talking about the condition of matter, why something can have potential energy if it's in a certain condition? If I have a spring, what happens if I compress it? Does it have more potential energy? Yep. Because of its compressed condition. And if I release that spring, it pops back in again. Okay? So that's an example of condition of matter. Well, in terms of kinetic energy, the two types of kinetic energy we're going to have most to do with will be sunlight energy and heat energy. In terms of potential energy, we're going to deal a lot with chemical bond energy. And so we'll be talking about molecules like glucose, for example. Remember, glucose has a fair amount of hydrogen to carbon in its molecules. And then particularly, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how the potential energy of glucose can be converted into the potential energy of ATP molecules. There are some really important laws of science that deal with energetics. And those particular laws of science are called laws of thermodynamics. Okay? These particular laws of thermodynamics, what does thermo mean? Heat. Okay? These particular laws were first developed by looking at the behavior of heat energy under certain conditions. There are two fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is pretty easy to understand. It's something that probably doesn't bend your mind too much. The second law of thermodynamics gets a little bit hairier, in part because it can be expressed in a number of different ways, some of which on the surface look a little bit contradictory to one another. In actuality, they aren't. So let's take a look at the first law of thermodynamics. First law of thermodynamics is also called the law of conservation of energy. Okay? What's the first law of thermodynamics say? Energy can't be created or destroyed, but what can we do with energy? We can transform it from one state to another. So we can change something from kinetic to potential energy and something from potential energy to kinetic energy. Okay? Good analogy for this is your car. Okay? Can your car convert potential energy into kinetic energy? How? Yeah, you can burn the fuel, gasoline in your gas tank and convert that into the kinetic energy of heat. And then that heat can be used to power motion of the car. What's another example of the conversion of potential energy to kinetic energy that you see operating in your car every morning? Pardon me?
I was going to say something else.
Okay. First thing you have to do when you get in your car, before you go anyplace. Put the key in and start it, right? And that starting involves kinetic energy of something turning a flywheel, which eventually gets your engine going. Where's that potential energy that provides that? It's in your battery, right? Okay. And what happens as you drive? The generator, or alternator, I guess now in all cars, converts the energy of motion back into the stored energy of the battery again. Okay? So cars are very great mechanical devices that allow us to convert energy from one form to another. So this particular law tells us that this energy transformation is not only allowable or permissible, but in terms of life, it is absolutely essential. Because ultimately, all of the chemical energy associated with organisms comes from where? Comes from the sun. Okay? So what's going on in the sun? Why is the sun and how is the sun producing energy? What is the sun? A big ball of what gas? Hydrogen, okay? Sun is loaded with hydrogen. And under the intense temperature and pressure due to gravitation, that hydrogen, those atoms, what happens to them? They get forced together. What do we call that process of forcing those hydrogen atoms together?
Fusion.
That's nuclear fusion. And does anybody know what's produced when we fuse hydrogen atoms together? Helium is produced, a different atom. Okay? And if we look at this, what we find out is that it appears that in this particular process, we lose mass. Because the mass of the hydrogens that are fused together is actually greater than the mass of the helium that's produced. Well, okay, that's interesting for a couple of reasons. What does this tell you is going to happen to the sun eventually? It's eventually going to burn itself out, right? It's going to exhaust all of its hydrogen fuel and produce helium, and then the sun becomes a big red giant, and that's the end of our solar system. Fortunately, estimates indicate that there's somewhere between 2 and 4 more billion years of nuclear fuel in the sun, so that this fusion process can keep going. Well, are we really losing mass? Well, as it turns out, no. Because there's another law of physics called the law of conservation of matter that says matter can't be created or destroyed. It can only be changed in form. So what's happening to some of this mass? It's being converted into what? Energy. What's the famous equation that describes this relationship when you convert mass into energy? Think of Albert Einstein. What do you think of? E equals mc squared. That describes the relationship between energy and mass or matter. So during this particular process of nuclear fusion, we're forcing hydrogen atoms together to form a new type of atom, and some of the mass of the hydrogens is being converted into energy. And that particular type of energy is called the electromagnetic spectrum. And the electromagnetic spectrum consists of all kinds of different forms of energy. These are the shorter wavelength forms of energy. And these are the longer wavelength forms of energy. What's more energetic or more destructive? Short wavelengths or long wavelengths? Short wavelengths, okay? So these are kind of things that we really have to worry about in terms of effects on human body or the cells. These, hopefully not, because we're constantly being exposed to these. In fact, we purposely generate these things, radio waves, infrared, remote controls and things like that, okay? Look where light is. Light's in the middle of the spectrum. So light has sufficient amount of energy to do some work, but not so much energy that it is damaging to cells. So biologically, what do we use the light energy for? What process? Photosynthesis, right? And what happens during photosynthesis? What are our reactants in the process of photosynthesis? What are our raw materials? What do you need to make this happen? Well, let's look at the other side. What do you produce? Sugar. What else do you produce besides sugar? Oxygen. So what are the starting materials? Well, there's got to be some source of carbon, right? Because glucose has carbon. What's the source of carbon? Carbon dioxide. There's also hydrogen in glucose, right? What's our source of hydrogen? Water. This represents a form of potential energy, food for cells. What are we making that out of? Does carbon dioxide really have any food energy? No. How about water? No. So are we creating energy? No. For this to work, we also need the sunlight energy. And we need a pigment to absorb that energy so we can do this transformation. So this represents a material that can be used to make other molecules. And remember what cells are. Cells are a bunch of molecules that all are functioning together in interacting with one another. And when molecules start interacting with one another, some interesting things start happening, like structures can replicate, or they can move, or they can transform chemical energy. What are all of those properties together called? They're called life, right? So life is really based upon the ability of molecules to interact. Where do we get those molecules in the first place? We produce them from things in the environment and use sunlight energy to drive the synthesis of those particular molecules. So all life as we know it depends upon this, which depends upon this. Now, actually in reality that's not totally true. Anytime you want an exception to the rule, go to the bacterial world. If you take microbiology, you'll find out that there are some microorganisms that can live without any dependence on light whatsoever. But that tends to be the exception rather than the rule. As far as we're concerned this semester, all living organisms rely directly or indirectly on sunlight energy. Okay? Because plants, which are the producers in our environment, trap the sunlight energy and make organic molecules like glucose, which then they use to make plant cells and organisms. And then what do animals do? Animals obtain their molecules from plants. Okay? So this conversion of energy is absolutely critically important for life on Earth to be sustained. And if the sun goes out eventually, then we don't have the light energy produced. Plants don't have any way to produce organic molecules by photosynthesis. Plants die, if plants die, animals die. Okay? Is it good if the Earth is bombarded by these forms of the electromagnetic spectrum? Nope, it isn't. These are deadly to cells. Even some of these forms of light, like ultraviolet radiation, are damaging to cells. They can cause skin cancers, for example, by mutating DNA. So how do organisms survive on Earth if we're being bombarded by this energy from the sun? What's protecting us? There are things in the atmosphere, and particularly there is a layer. What layer is that filters out a lot of this bad stuff? Ozone layer? Where does ozone come from? Ozone is produced by a chemical reaction between oxygen atoms. Was there always oxygen in the atmosphere of our planet? No. Before life arose, there was no oxygen. And even after some of the primitive forms of life arose, there still wasn't oxygen until what happened? Until there was photosynthesis. Okay? So all the oxygen that's present in our atmosphere now, and that we depend upon for aerobic cellular respiration, comes from photosynthesis. Once there was oxygen in the atmosphere, there could be ozone. And once there was ozone, there was this protective shielding around the Earth now that filtered out these harmful forms of radiation. So how did life exist on the planet when this process was first gearing up, or even before photosynthesis evolved? Where did we find the first organisms? Were they just sitting out on the land? No, where did they live? They lived in the water. Why? Because water can filter out these harmful forms of radiation. So the evolution of photosynthesis was important for a number of reasons. Its waste product produced the oxygen, which was later used in a more efficient form of cellular respiration, the aerobic form of cellular respiration. And when we talk about that process, we'll talk about the relative efficiency of aerobic respiration versus fermentation, which you're going to be studying in lab this week. Aerobic's much more efficient in utilizing the energy of sugar. But the other thing that the evolution of photosynthesis did is it provided the oxygen, which provided the ozone. And once that protective shielding had developed, it allowed organisms to transition from aquatic environments to land environments. And that opened up a whole new set of habitats that organisms previously hadn't been able to exploit. Okay? Radiation, you've got to deal with radiation. That's one of the concerns we have about long-term space travel, even to Mars, is the amount of radiation that astronauts would be exposed to. Very deadly, very damaging to cells. Okay, so a long explanation of the importance of energy being able to be transformed from sunlight energy into chemical energy, specifically glucose during photosynthesis. So this just represents kinetic and potential energy. So climbing up the steps to the diving platform is converting the kinetic energy of muscle movement into the potential energy of position or elevation. And then as you dive back down again, that potential energy of position is converted into the kinetic energy of motion or falling. Okay, second law of thermodynamics. One way you can define the second law of thermodynamics is in terms of states of stability. The second law of thermodynamics says that all matter tends to spontaneously, remember what that means, it means on its own, move to the greatest possible state of stability. For an atom, when is that atom most stable? When its outermost valence shell or shell electron shells are full. Okay? So if you look at the periodic table, there are some of those noble gases over there on the right, like neon and argon and krypton, where the outermost valence shell is completely full of electrons. Those atoms are stable. And things that are stable tend to be unreactive. Most atoms are not stable. So hydrogen, for example, a single electron. Its outermost shell holds 2. So it's unstable. Oxygen, outermost shell is not filled. It's got 6 electrons in its outermost shell. It needs 8 to be stable. It's not. So what do unstable things tend to do? Unstable things tend to react with other unstable things to become stable. They rob electrons from one another, or they share electrons from one another. And that's chemical bonding. So the second law of thermodynamics explains for us why chemical bonding occurs, and chemical bonding is the basis of life. So the second law of thermodynamics ultimately explains a lot of things about life. Another way you can define the second law of thermodynamics is in terms of concentration. All matter tends to spontaneously move from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. Remember, that was part of our definition of diffusion. So the same basic law of science explains 2 quite different phenomena: chemical bonding and diffusion. Another way that you can define the second law of thermodynamics is to talk about a new phenomena that we haven't really talked about yet. The phenomena of free energy. Second law says that all matter tends to spontaneously move from states of high free energy to states of lower free energy. So what does a state of high free energy mean? The higher the free energy, the less stable you are. The more reactive you are, if you like. Another way to say that would be is the more concentrated you are. States of low free energy are more stable, or in terms of diffusion, they're less concentrated. An analogy that I will use a lot will be the energy hill. And a rock sitting right at the edge of that hill, and then the bottom of the hill. The rock up here is very unstable. It's at a state of high free energy. And given even just a little tiny push, it's going to spontaneously roll down that hill, and it will continue to roll until it reaches the bottom and stops. So it'll move from a state of high free energy to a state of low free energy spontaneously. Okay? If you want to push something back up the hill again, that's going to require an input of energy. Okay? So this is like going from high concentration to low concentration, diffusion, or facilitated diffusion. This is like going from low concentration to high concentration, active transport. Okay? So start thinking about free energy states, because we're going to be using that term a fair amount. Well, there's another way to look at the second law of thermodynamics, and that's using another concept, and that is the concept of entropy. Entropy is something that gives you information about a system. So it's a measurement of a quality of a system. What is entropy measuring? It has to do with energy, and it's related to energy, but entropy is actually a measurement of something else about a system. how chaotic it is, or how organized it is, or disorganized it is. Entropy is a measurement of the disorganization of the system. So this always gets a little confusing. But the more disorganized something is, the higher its state of entropy. The more organized something is, the lower its state of entropy. Okay, think about that in terms of concentration. If something is concentrated, is it organized or disorganized? It's all packed together in a tight little bundle. It's organized. And then when something is diffuse or spread out, it's disorganized. So what is the second law of thermodynamics going to say about the tendency of matter in regard to this idea of entropy? Things always move from states of high entropy to states of low entropy. Is that right? No. The second law of thermodynamics predicts what happens to matter in these particular relationships. Things move from high concentration to low concentration. They move from states of organization to states of disorganization. States of organization are low states of entropy. States of disorganization are high states of entropy. All of these contribute to a state of high free energy. This is states of low free energy. Does anybody ever get bugged by your roommate about a messy room? Or do you ever complain to your roommates about a messy room? What might your roommate say to you? Sorry, I can't do anything about it. It's all about the second law of thermodynamics, which says what? Left to their own, spontaneously, things get messy, things get disorganized. Right? Well, having had a biology class that deals with energetics, how might you respond? Is there any way to fight that natural tendency of the second law of thermodynamics for things to get disorganized or messy? Yeah, do some work. Apply energy. Okay? What are cells? Well, remember, cells are molecules. They're a bunch of molecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. And they're all put together in a particular ordered fashion. So think of a cell membrane. What is it? It's a bunch of phospholipids and proteins all put together in a particular fashion to make something we call a cell membrane. Or a mitochondria is a bunch of molecules put together in a particular structure to produce energy. So cells are organized. The individual molecules tend to be kind of disorganized. So cells are states of low entropy. What happens to states of low entropy? They tend to spontaneously move to higher entropy. They tend to spontaneously become disorganized. What's another term that we could use to describe for a cell the greatest state of entropy of that cell? Dead, right? Okay, a living cell is highly organized, state of low entropy. If a cell becomes disorganized, it's dead. It's not functioning anymore. So how do cells maintain this state of high entropy when the second law of thermodynamics says, low entropy, when the second law of thermodynamics say it should become disorganized? It does work, right? Like cleaning up the room. That is one of the ways you can counteract that basic law of science that says things always get more disorganized, is to put an input of work in there to maintain that organization. Cells are the basic unit of life, right? So literally maintaining life, maintaining cell structure is work. And it requires a constant input of energy. And what happens if you deprive the cell of energy for even a little bit? Second law of thermodynamics says what's going to happen. The cell's going to start dying. It's going to start losing its organization. It's going to lose its function. And pretty soon we have death. So what is the cell constantly having to do? It's constantly having to spend ATP to maintain its cellular organization and to fight that inevitable tendency, second law of thermodynamics, for things to get messy, for things to disorganize, for things to die. So what happens if someone suffocates? They're deprived of oxygen for too long, right? Well, so why is that important? Aerobic cellular respiration, the really efficient kind, requires oxygen to produce what? ATP. And if you can't produce enough ATP, your brain cells particularly, which have a very high energy demand, start losing the ability to do the work to maintain their organization. Second law of thermodynamics ensures that they will die. What separates your brain cells from death? A few minutes. And so ultimately, if your cells aren't producing ATP 24/7, 365, then they start dying. And that can all be traced back to this particular law of science that explains what matter tends to do spontaneously on its own. It becomes disorganized. So think about that when we talk about how cell respiration works, and understand that it's this process of cellular respiration that separates your cells from being a bunch of disorganized molecules as opposed to an organized functioning unit called a cell, which carries out these processes that we say are life. Okay? So we will continue here on Thursday and talk about some more gnarly things about free energy and endergonic and exergonic. So try to read ahead if you can.